to get going, KJ is a peace activist and journalist and scholar specializing in geopolitics of the Asian continent, but pretty much everywhere. He writes for Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, Peace and Planet News, and others. He's a special correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints on the pivot to Asia, the Koreas, and the Pacific. KJ, we're honored to have you back again. And I had two primary questions because I need to try and find a way to get through some of the discourse of late, which seems to be just repetitive. Like uh, we attacked Iran and it was a mistake. Israel's going to try and blow up the agreement, which is Israel. Ukraine and Russia keep going. So I want to start off with Russia and Ukraine because about a year and a half ago, um, most people, most commentators, most people on podcasts were saying Russia's won. There's no chance that Ukraine can stop Russia. And here we are a year later from when I was hearing all that, and Ukraine seems to be bouncing back. Ukraine seems to be damaging Russia. Is this what is going on? Is this just Western media propaganda, or what do you know about the status of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine? Because here we are
Well,
again.
yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to emphasize here is that Russia most certainly has defeated Ukraine. But what has transpired in the meantime is that all of NATO has gotten involved. So now it is overtly and clearly a war between Russia and NATO. And on that level, the war has not ended. It has not been a clear-cut win for Russia. But if you look at basically the map, the territory of war, you can see that Russia is making continuous and significant advances in the Donbass, which is originally what its goal of the special military operation was. And of course, Ukraine, aided by NATO, is continuing to make sporadic attacks inside Russia against Moscow and Crimea and other places. So it is engaging in a form of terror. But I think that over the long term, Russia still has the advantage. It's simply that the war has expanded in depth and horizontally. And in that sense, yes, it's not a clear-cut advantage for Russia. But also, I think we have to be very careful about this. And I think your instinct about the propaganda is correct, is that what we're hearing out of the Western media should be mostly discounted because they're trying to win the war in the media, in the public, in the domain of public opinion. And I think that is highly misleading. You and I don't need to, recall the fact that, until the US was bugging out of Saigon, the US was still continuing to win the, war in Vietnam, although by 1968, it was pretty obvious that it was all over.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what is now stopping? Well, if you, so it sounds to me like you just said, if I can repeat this in my own language, um, Ukraine basically is just the launching point for NATO attacks on Russia. Because if a NATO attack came from a NATO country, that would be a problem.
Yes, yes. And it still is a problem because the Russians know very well that NATO is involved. This is, British, French, US intelligence that is doing the targeting and all the support, including probably the mobilization of the weapons platforms themselves. So certainly it is involved, but at the very least, they have a minimum plausible deniability which is being chipped away at. But if it were actually to, if there were attacks from Poland or from Germany or, you know, other European countries, then it would be a completely different story. And we may yet be going into that. We may still see a complete and total world war in Europe. Certainly the rhetoric seems to signal in that direction, although clearly, the military, the martial spirit is willing, but the military industrial flesh is weak. I don't think they're up to it yet. And this is why they're still continuing to engage in these kind of harassment attacks, which are not insignificant. And they're certainly very, painful. Majority of them are war crimes, but still it doesn't turn the tide of the battle. Remember, Russia is engaging in a slow simmer. It's a slow war of attrition. They're trying not to expand the war with Europe, although there are strong voices that would like to escalate much, much faster and harder inside Russia itself. But Putin himself, has been moving this in a very limited, contained fashion because he doesn't want a general war with Europe. And of course, one metric that we should watch, Jim, and again, you and I know from observing the Vietnam War, is first, casualty counts are very, very unreliable. Certainly Western casualty counts that say that, there are 10 Russians being killed for every Ukrainian. That's just nonsense. And you have to actually look at other metrics. One is conscription. Now, Russia doesn't have general conscription. Ukraine is conscripting, every man, woman, child, and dog into their military. And then you can also look at the type of conscription they're doing. You're seeing people being shanghaied off the streets. These are just the images we're seeing. So we can imagine that there's a lot more of this going on. People are being shanghaied off the streets and beaten and forced to fight. And literally it looks like, NATO wants to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, except it looks like they are rapidly reaching the point of the last Ukrainians. The other piece to look at also is the number of Ukrainians who are abroad. I mean, there are vast numbers of men who have escaped because they want nothing to do with this war. And they're all over Europe and, all over the world, essentially. And once again, when you see people escaping the ship, that the ship is sinking. So I think these are other metrics we should look at, but we should certainly look at Western propaganda with a very, very jaundiced eye. And I say jaundiced with deliberation because we know that, for example, in Europe, it is illegal now to have any contact with RT. Not only is RT totally banned in Europe, in the EU, it is totally banned inside Switzerland, which is technically neutral. And anybody who retweets an RT article, even if it's just on soccer, will face criminal charges. That's how paranoid and frightened the Europeans are that their propaganda regime might crack and, be shown up for what it is.
And for those that don't know, RT stands for Russian television. And you can go there and I can still get it on my computer and it does decent reporting. If it's coming from Russia, I'm taking it with a grain of salt. If it's coming from the United States, I'm taking it with a grain of salt for sure. So, but you can get some information. So they blacked out RT in Europe. That's amazing. Well, how from your perspective, what's the standing of the war? I mean, it's dragged on. How are the Russian people feeling about the war?
I don't have direct contact except for one colleague who is in Crimea. He seems to think that it hasn't affected them. He says morale is good, economy is good, people are doing well. And you see people going around with their lives as normal in Russia as usual. Whereas, for example, in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine, people are ready to, overthrow this U.S. quisling Zelensky government. So I think that once again, even morale is another indicator. There's one side which has high morale, and the other side which is, sick and tired and escaping, and also wants to overthrow its own government, yet is still captured by its extreme far right and its quisling US NATO agenda.
You brought up the United States, and Trump is like a bouncing ball, and he's hard to get a hold of. But we used to get the idea that he was a a Putin asset or a Putin friend, and then he yells at Zelensky in the Oval Office. And now I understand he was telling Zelensky to go harder at Russia. So, do you have can you grab this bouncing ball called Trump and try and say, okay, where is he standing right now? Where's the United States? Are we fully behind what's going on with NATO and supplying? And
I think the US deep state still wants to bleed out Russia by using Ukraine as a proxy. There's tactical differences within the national security state. Some of them want more commitment, others want less commitment. Currently, uh, you know the the administration looks like it wants to offload as much of the burden of bleeding out Russia onto the Europeans themselves. And this is a kind of mercantile calculation. They don't want to spend a penny more than they need to, hence all the language of burden sharing and of division of labor. So I think it's headed in that direction, although there are people, who are still much more Atlanticist than the current
mm,
Trump administration, which isn't to say there isn't pressure on Trump to go one way or the other. And as we know, President Trump is something of a weather vane, depending on who he most recently spoke to. Still, that agenda of attacking and undermining Russia is constant. I think there's a difference in tactics, how they should go about it. The reason why they want to offload more of the burden onto Europe is because the ruling imperial class, as they've said for at least a decade now, certainly longer, really, they see the main target and the main enemy as China. And so they want to marshal their forces and eventually actually pivot to kinetic war against China. All of these logistical preparations are already happening. Information war is increasing once again. You see theater preparations, battle rehearsal, all of that is happening right now as we speak. And so, it's ultimately the deep agenda of the deep state to take the war to China. Russia and Iran were supposed to be side dishes, distractions, except they got, pulled into the black hole. But they haven't given up on their agenda to take down China.
I guess that leads right to the next question, um, which is that I've had. Uh, you've been talking about on several of our shows about the United States goal to take down China for years. And you talked about a variety of plans from the United States on how to take down China, and that I think you predicted that, or you were looking at uh, us being involved in a kinetic war with China by 27, 29, something like this. But
That was the US's own prediction, right?
yes,
The
yeah,
the Minahan window and there were two windows anyway between 2025 and 2027. The US made its own predictions that it would be at war with China.
with China. So,
Yeah.
all right. So, my long winded question is, have we learned anything by getting our butts kicked by Iran? Have we, you have, I mean, we couldn't take, we couldn't impact Iran. Uh, Iran has the upper hand here. I would think that our military, that the people that know what they're doing would say, well, geez, we couldn't do Iran. Let's leave China alone. Have we learned enough to do that? Or is China still on the chopping block?
I think China is still on the chopping block as far as I can tell. But let me turn the question back to you, Jim. After Korea, the US essentially lost the war, and it lost the war against an impoverished country, people fighting with sneakers in the snow, mismatched rifles. They were bombed into the Stone Age, and the US essentially still lost. And General MacArthur said, anybody who wants to get involved in a land war in Asia needs to have their head examined. So, did we learn anything from Korea?
Dang it, you got me.
Okay, so from 1955 onwards, the US was already involved in Vietnam. Okay, and then it bombed Vietnam into the Stone Age and Laos and Cambodia. And once again, it got its rear end kicked by a bunch of impoverished peasants, who, gave it, the most humiliating defeat since Korea. Did we learn anything from Vietnam?
No. So
You had to struggle there, but yeah.
yeah, I know. Well, because when I came back from Vietnam, um, and moved on to college and whatever, I was absolutely sure. And I had a couple of weeks ago we had Bill Earhart on the show, and he's a poet
Yes.
and a Vietnam veteran, and he had the same perspective I did, and I thought, good grief, great, I'm not so naive, but he was actually saying that he was sure, and I was saying I was sure my generation, my boomer generation, would never let another situation like Vietnam ever happen again. And since then, oh, well, there's been Iraq, there's been Afghanistan, and now we've got Iran, which, it didn't take us long to lose, but we're still there
Yeah,
in some sort of fashion.
so we're losing faster and in more definitive ways. The question is, are we learning faster? Are we learning at all? And I really don't think we are. I mean, just the larger perspective. People used to say after World War One, never again, right? Then we had World War Two, never again. Then we had the Korean War, et cetera, et cetera. The leaders and the politicians are not learning. They seem to be incapable of learning. And of course, on the other hand, people who even most people won't acknowledge that we lost. They still won't acknowledge that this has been a strategic defeat of, stupendous proportions. But instead, you'll hear things like, if they acknowledge the glimmer of possibility that we lost, they will always say, we lost the war because of the politicians and we fought with one hand tied behind our back. We were too, gentle, too kind, too restrained, despite unleashing untold devastation, violence, bombing, genocidal murder on these,
Mhm.
on these, poor countries that were trying to defend themselves. So each time there's the same tropes and the same delusion. And we have to ask the question, why is the leadership so resistant to learning? Why can't they seem to get the message?
Please.
And yeah, I mean, I would say that hegemony is one hell of a drug. Power is one hell of a drug, and it's hard to get off that drug. And so you think that, just like the gambler thinks that they just need to have one more good roll and they'll win all of it back. The fool's reward for failure is greater ambition. And so, having lost Iran, I think there's a good chunk of the US ruling class says, okay, we paper this over, declare victory, and then we move on to the Pacific. And if you look at the chatter coming out of the ruling class think tanks, this is literally what they're saying. CSIS is talking about, war footing, that we have to get onto war footing immediately. that we have to prepare for a two-front war between Russia and China, with Russia and China, although it's actually a three-front war at the current moment. Foreign affairs, Eli Ratner, has rolled out his wonkish, 50-point plan for all the different ways that you can attack China. Seth Jones in foreign affairs has said, yeah, we just use some nukes to thin out Chinese troops. And he's talking about using nukes to thin out Chinese troops. It's not even something that he's trying to justify. It's not even something that he's proposing. It's not something that's being discussed. It's something that's assumed. So they're preparing. It's kind of an assumption among the ruling class that we're going to nuke them. And then, of course, you can see the logistics, the rehearsal, all the incredibly belligerent exercises that are being conducted right now within, arm's length of China, and then the constant information war and provocation. Just one example of this information war is the US has just recently passed, I think it's legislation, House Legislation 444, and they have designated President Xi as committing crimes against humanity. And this is the kind of language or the kind of legislation you pass just before you engage in regime change efforts or a coup or war. So none of it is dialing down. It is constantly, increasing. And I think that all of these are very, very bad signals. Nothing is certain, in political affairs. But as far as we can see, you pass Senate Resolution 444 and you accuse the president of China as of engaging in systemic deception, warmongering, crimes against humanity, and then blame him for everything from COVID to, get this, garlic, which is grown with human, human manure. I mean, there's a term for that. We call that organic vegetables, right? I mean, this is a crime against humanity as far as they're concerned. So all of this signals that there is very, very bad. There are very, very bad designs afoot. Make no mistake about that.
Our hypocrisy knows no bounds. Um, so, well, okay, with the debacle with Iran, does that at least delay what we're going to be doing with China?
Yes.
Maybe. Yes. Okay. So maybe I'm trying to be hopeful here. So maybe a new group of leaders, possibly another administration, a different administration comes in. Is that a possibility to get this thing derailed, or is the deep state and the those powers that be, are they unstoppable?
Well, I think it boils back down once again to the fact that hegemony is one hell of a drug, and it's hard to get off of it. And we have seen up to the current moment really no difference between different regimes. Trump, the Obama administration essentially declared war against China in 2011. They drew out a plan of war in 2009. And then the coming out party was 2011 when they declared the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia had both an economic war and a kinetic war dimension, as well as a encirclement. So that was the Obama administration. And then Trump came in and people elected Trump because they didn't want the endless wars of Obama, which Obama was elected because they didn't want the endless wars of Bush. So Trump is elected. And what does he do? He continues the hostile policies and takes it up a notch. And instead of doing this kind of circuitous economic war that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was about, which is a form of shunning and exclusion, he takes it directly to them in the form of a trade war. And then Trump is replaced by Biden. And does Biden dial anything down? No, he escalates it up by several notches, starting with their first meeting in Anchorage, where they try and berate the Chinese and attack them directly. And then they, accelerate and tighten the Trump administration's trade war, making it even more severe. Their plan was to prevent China from developing at all. They wanted to lock it out completely from technological development, with these extraordinary measures that were, drafted out of CSIS. So the continual escalation, and then after the Biden administration is replaced by the Trump 2 administration, has any of this dialed down? No. You replace, the trade war with a direct tariff frontal. So you can see that the mindset, the ideology moves only in one direction. It's a ratchet effect. There is no dialing back. There is only moving forward and accelerate and moving up the escalation ladder. And I think that's pretty clear that whoever gets in, I think they have to toe the line. This is a preset agenda. It really goes back to the 90s. But even before the 90s, let's take the long historical sweep of things. From 1949 until 1979, the US was essentially at war with China. Mm-hmm. When I say war, I mean hot war, that was the Korean War. I mean proxy war, that was the Vietnam War, because McNamara said in the Pentagon Papers, this war only makes sense if we understand it as a war against China. And then there was also dirty war, that was Yunnan, Myanmar attacks against Yunnan from proxy forces in Myanmar and from Taiwan province, and also in Tibet. So dirty war, proxy war, and hot war. That was continuous for 30 years from 1949 until 1979. Then from 1979, for another 30 years, until about 2009, there was a period of hedging. So it wasn't overt war, but it was a kind of hybrid war with a bit of hedging that involved an attempt to absorb China into the US system. There's the reform and opening up period, entry into the World Trade Organization, and investment in China, etc. And the leaders of that time say they will overtly admit to you this was an attempt at regime change. We expected to absorb China. We were going to buy it out, corrupt it, and turn it into a tenant farmer on the capitalist plantation. That didn't work. And so then that shifted again after 2009, another 30-year period. And the current period, really, we have to understand, once again, as the US have shifted back into a war footing against China. Why was 2009 the turning point? It was the period of the collapse of the global capitalist financial system. The assumption between 1979 and 2009 was that China was going to collapse. It was destined for collapse. And the best thing that it could do before it collapsed from its own internal contradictions was to let itself be absorbed into the global capitalist system as a subaltern junior partner, tenant farmer on the capitalist plantation. That was what was supposed to happen. But a funny thing happened on the way to that expectation. In 2009, the entire global Western financial system collapsed on its own ears. We know that, 2007, 2008, financial debacle.
And China didn't.
China didn't. In fact, it helped the other countries, including the US, come out of this in one piece. And no good deed goes unpunished. And when the US realized that China was not going to collapse of its own accord, that it was not a Potemkin state that Hillary Clinton had claimed that it was not, as Bill Clinton said, China was trying to hold Jello up against a wall, it just had to surrender to the end of history, which was liberal capitalist hegemony. When they realized that that was not going to happen organically, that's when the daggers came out and they began planning for war. And so in 2009, they explicitly drafted a doctrine of war against China called air-sea battle, based on the doctrine of war against the Soviet Union, which is based on Israeli war doctrine. Air-sea battle, air-land battle Colloquially, they're known as shock and awe. So they began planning shock and awe against China since 2009. They revised the war plans 11 times because war plans get revised. And they also began this plan of economic encirclement and isolation called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But the current period, from 2009 up to the current period, we really have to understand is a resumption of war against China. And nothing that I have seen indicates that there has been any change in grand strategy towards China, as far as I can see.
Well, that's really unfortunate. So let me ask you this.
Well, let me answer your second part of the question,
Okay.
Harvey. Just hold that question. But you asked, has the debacle with Iran slowed down their ambitions? I would say it hasn't blunted them, but it has delayed their ambitions. And so if you recall, there was the Minahan window and the Davidson window, 2025 and 2027. This was literally when they predicted they would be at war with China.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're almost in 2027, and clearly the US is in no shape to directly attack China because the magazine has been depleted in Iran and in Ukraine. And that's very, very clear. And these are structural reasons. The US has deindustrialized, and it has boutique arms manufacturers that build arms very, very slowly at stupendous costs because they're charging, $100,000 for a dime bag of bushings or washers.
Yeah.
And the Pentagon has never passed a audit in its life. So, it's a cesspit of the entire military industrial procurement system is a cesspit of corruption, which is completely inefficient and incapable of generating the industrial capacity for actually fighting a war. But even so, they have not let go of those ambitions. And what they're really planning on is outsourcing military industrial base to other countries, primarily Japan and South Korea, because they see these as industrial powers that are reliably colonized vassals. So that's the agenda right now. So that's what they're counting on. But all of this has put a crimp in their plans for rapid war. And so they have pushed it out beyond 2027. I would say probably they pushed it out a couple of years, but they also know that the clock is ticking against them. Originally, Rand said in 2015 that we have to go to war by 2020-25. Otherwise, China becomes too powerful. Well, I think that threshold has already been crossed, but I think that they haven't come to grips with reality. So ultimately, they're fighting reality. They're not even fighting China, Iran, or Russia. They're fighting reality. And that's the problem with being addicted to power. It is one hell of a drug, and the distortion field that it creates is impossible to refute.
Good grief, because that means reality doesn't get through when you're addicted like that
Yes.
to the power. Because I was going to ask, and you mentioned Japan and South Korea. I was hoping that Japan and South Korea, looking at the debacle in Iran, would say, United States, we're no longer going to be vassals. We're no longer going to be part of your encirclement or your staging area for China. Is any of that possible?
With South Korea, you can see that the South Korean president, progressive president, is trying to detach Korea from US's plans to weaponize it, to Ukrainize it, to use it against China. And one of the key things that he's done is he's demanded operational control of South Korean troops back to the Korean government. As we've discussed before,
Mm-hmm.
US government controls South Korea's 3.6 million troops, 500,000 regular troops and 3.1 million reserve troops, all highly trained, ready to fight at the drop of a hat. This creates an incredible moral hazard because the US gets an incredible supply of cannon fodder to throw against China. This makes war much, much more likely. And the Koreans don't want it. Certainly the Koreans who conscripted don't want it. Korea is one of the longest conscriptions in the world and one of the most brutal militaries in the world. And all of this is because they're essentially serving US designs for war against China. So the Koreans on the ground don't want it, and the progressive Korean government does not want it. And Lee Jae-myung has made strong demands that he wants OPCON back by 2029. Let me emphasize once again, it is extraordinary. It is an extraordinary situation in international affairs that the sovereign military of a sovereign country, if we can call it that, should be controlled by another country.
Absolutely.
Any country that exists under those circumstances, is not a sovereign country. But anyway, Yoon Suk-yeol has asked for operational control back, and the US has responded. Essentially, the US passed the NDAA, the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, and inside the NDAA, they explicitly say they prohibit a reduction in US military posture on the Korean Peninsula or a change in wartime operational control over the CFC until the Secretary of Defense certifies, blah, blah, blah. It's essentially, they're telling Yoon Suk-yeol in the NDAA, go F yourself. We are not giving up control over your troops. So that is a hard road to hoe. Yoon Suk-yeol is facing an uphill battle. And to add insult to injury, the Trump administration has just appointed Michelle Steele to be the US ambassador to South Korea. Michelle Steele is what we would refer to as a regime change ambassador. She's been appointed to undermine and attack Yoon Suk-yeol. Even before she was appointed ambassador, she was saying that, Lee Jae-myung, the current president Lee Jae-myung, she was saying that Lee Jae-myung had been elected illegitimately in a fraudulent election as a stooge for China, and that he's a communist. So she's a complete bonkers nutter. But the fact that they have appointed this person to become the representative of the US government to South Korea lets you know what their agenda is. Essentially, if they can get away with it, they will try to create a regime change. So that's one piece of it. Now, Japan is more solidly a US vassal. Remember, Japan surrendered to the United States. The US wrote the Japanese constitution. It wrote into Japan the peace article, Article 9, which said Japan, will never wage war and will not have a military. All of that has been salami sliced to death. The Japanese ruling party, the LDP, is one party, has had one party rule since its inception in 1955, with except very, very short glitches in the matrix. Japan is essentially a one-party state. And that one-party state, the LDP, the party, was put into power by the CIA. It is a product of the CIA. Mm-hmm. And it was cobbled together from a coalition of unrepentant war criminals, organized crime, the Japanese Yakuza, and war industrialists, militarists, the industrial tycoons of the Japanese military industrial machine. These came together and they created this revisionist, unrepentant, fascist party that has held one-party rule up to the current moment. And they are dead set on escalating to war with China. And the US is doing everything that it can to facilitate this, including encouraging Japan's remilitarization. Now, just to give you a little step back, let's remember once again, Japan was the psychopathic, genocidal war criminal of the Far East. It genocided vast swaths of the Asian continent, all over Southeast Asia, all over China. colonized Korea, colonized Taiwan province, colonized North China, Manchuria. It ran a slave state in Manchuria with which it became rich and powerful. Essentially, it had its own Belgian Congo in the north of
Yep.
China. Japan is an unrepentant genocidal state. And it was put into the penalty box after World War II, and its arms were taken away. It was demilitarized. Now, the United States, as its empire is starting to unravel, it is using every proxy that it can find, including Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and Taiwan province. It is looking all around for proxies to do its dirty work for it. But in particular, it is remilitarizing, it's encouraging the remilitarization of Japan. What this is analogous to is like, when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, it released its worst psychopathic criminals from its prisons and armed them and told them, go out and do your worst. Well, this is essentially what the United States is doing with Japan, but on a national level. So, the war criminal has been let out of the penalty box and has been given his arms back. And the message there is do what you will. And Japan has already hinted at what it will do. It will get into a war with China, and it will use Taiwan as a pretext.
Japan would more be happy to go to war with China, knowing that the United States is there, apparently, or this is just so bizarre to me because there has to be somebody, has to be people in Japan who have studied history, who knows what's going on, can look at the big picture and say no. But you're saying that Japan is clearly in the U.S. umbrella and are, well, could I say, waiting in the wings for the United States to do something against China?
They're waiting for the signal. They're waiting for the signal. They're waiting for the provocation. But Japan is through and through the leadership, not the people, but the leadership are U.S. vassals through and through, which is why on July 4th, you had all these like signs and displays of Trump and Takaichi together on Japanese billboards. I mean, they were celebrating the 4th of July more than the US was. This is why Sanae Takaichi went to Australia and she knelt on her hands and knees in front of the unknown Australian soldier. But she has never apologized to, the millions of Koreans and Chinese that she has killed. But she literally went down. She was wearing a short pencil skirt and high heels, and then she went down on her hands and knees to beg forgiveness of the, Australians who had perished in the Pacific War. So that tells you the level of sycophantic vassalization, which is so deeply ingrained inside the Japanese leadership. The Japanese people don't want the war. They're out on the streets protesting against Japanese militarization every single day. Mm-hmm. And of course, yes, there are good historians, there are good scholars, there are good public intellectuals who have spoken out against it. But once again, Japan is thoroughly inside the control, under the thumb of the United States and its comprador militarist elite.
So, just to make sure I get this straight, the leader of Japan in a pencil skirt got down on her hands and knees and begged forgiveness of the Caucasians in Australia.
Yes.
But has never done anything to apologize to the brutality it affected against China or Japan.
Or Korea.
Or Korea. Yes. China, Korea.
Yes.
Or China or Korea.
Yes. This is absolutely 100% true. And in fact, when she was in the Diet, the Japanese legislature, she passed a rule saying that Japan could not apologize for its war crimes because there were none. And she, tried to backpedal any other previous, cursory statements that other Japanese leaders had made on a very kind of pro forma basis. Yes, so she believes that Japan did nothing wrong to to the Asian people that were its neighbors, and yet she goes down on her hands and knees and apologizes to the white Caucasian Australian settler colonialists, that it fought.
Uh, all right. Is that racist or is that nationalist? Or is it both?
I think it's insane.
Okay.
I think at a certain point we don't even need to bother with titles, but I think there is a very, very strong dimension of racist nationalism inside Japanese culture. And, not to get too, Frankfurt School on you, but go and look at a Japanese manga, a Japanese cartoon, and you'll see that all the heroes look Caucasian, and all the villains look extremely Asian. Actually look extremely Japanese. So there's a way in which there's been a kind of a internalization that they associate themselves as being more Western, and they also lionize and sycophantically worship the West.
That that is so disappointing. Just so disappointing as a Westerner myself. You try and look at other people and think, okay, they would never do what we're doing, and here they are doing what we're doing.
Well, Japan is unique among Asian states because you really have to see it as one of the it was one of the colonial powers, along with the Western imperial colonial powers. It was one of the colonial powers, and it actually has a long history of bad actions. Of course, this isn't to say there are any pure, faultless states around the world. But even, with that low bar, Japan stands out as an early colonial military power with very, very violent intentions towards its neighbors. It was a militarist society, very, very different, say, from Confucian China. It had this entire martial outlook towards the world, what they call Bushido. And starting from 1592, the Japanese were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. They were kidnapping Koreans and Chinese, selling them to the Portuguese, where they would be, sold off as slaves. And then in the late 19th century, they joined arms with Germany, imported their technology and military strategies and military culture, and then they became a major colonial power. I think the best way to think of Japan is like a cross between Germany and the UK. That is to say, the UK was a small island power that through early colonization, slavery became very, very powerful, and then went on to colonize, most of the world. Japan is like that. It has the same mentality, outlook, and that was amplified by its early adoption of German industry and technology.
Good grief. This is once again very disappointing. Very, well, if I can try and bring a little bit of hope here, you mentioned about Korea. Is it possible for the current South Korean administration um, to just say, no, we're not? If the U.S. generates something, even though there's that agreement, even though the NDAA requires them to, is it possible that South Korea could just say, no, we're not doing it?
It's theoretically possible, and then we'd have to see what happens next. I mean, technically, what could happen is all hell could break loose. As I said, the current president is a progressive. He's working class. He, started as a child laborer when he was 12 years old. Says he was beaten every day at his factory. Had his arms mangled twice. Somehow, through hard work, but also, through extraordinary luck, he managed to go to university, became a labor lawyer, and then he became, a mayor. and then he became the governor of a major province, and then was defeated once, but then became president. So he's a person with tremendous internal strength. He has weathered the worst that life could throw at him. And I don't have to tell you how bad or how much difficulties he has overcome. He's a man with tremendous integrity and internal strength. At least that's what I believe. But can he just say no to the United States? Well, the president before him, not Yoon Suk-yeol, but Moon Jae-in, when he was first elected, he was elected after writing a book that said, "We're going to say no to the United States." I
Yeah.
want to be a country that can say no to the United States. He was not capable of saying that. And just one example, Moon Jae-in said, no THAAD weapons on Korean soil, no THAAD interceptors on Korean soil. He said that. He gave a direct order to his military. And do you know what the military did?
Did they just put them on anyway?
Yeah, they just put them on Korean soil anyway. And he asked them why and why he wasn't notified. He said, this is the Korean military leadership saying to Moon Jae-in, President Moon Jae-in at the time, we had a non-disclosure agreement with the US. We couldn't tell you.
Oh,
So
Christ.
that's how it goes. So yes, could he say no? Yes, he could. And then what would happen next? The centers of power in Korea, the center of power in Korea really still resides with the multinational corporations and the military, and then the intelligence services. So there are strong centers of power. Any politician that wants to survive and get his agenda implemented has to learn how to work with these centers of power. Would they go along with him saying, just no, we're not in for war, we want OPCON back, etc.? As I said, the US has appointed a regime change ambassador to Korea. There is a guy called Morse Tan. He's a former US ambassador at large, currently in Korea, trying to stir up trouble. So I would say that within the US deep state, there are a lot of people who have it out for Lee Jae-myung, the current president. And so I think Lee Jae-myung is constrained. I don't know that he can take bold moves, although who knows, he might. And if he were to say, no, we're not being pulled into your war, no, we want OPCON back, I'm sure there would be massive support from the Korean people. As I said, once again, every Korean goes through, and during my period, it was 3 to 4 years of conscription. Currently, it's a little under 2 years, but every Korean male gives up a significant chunk of their youth in service as essentially bonded labor for the US military machine. If he said no to US OPCON, then what he could also do is he could dial back military conscription. And I think that would make him very, very popular. But is he allowed to do that? Will he be allowed to do that? I don't know. I don't think it will be easy. Certainly, we have a counterexample in Taiwan. Taiwan had a 3-month, I think 3 or 4 month conscription. It's been extended to 1 year on the command of the United States.
Good gracious. Good gracious. Okay, let's turn back to the United States real quick because you mentioned about hegemony as a strong drug, but also we do have some people who in the United States, like you, that understand history. Doesn't anybody in charge or anybody in the deep state realize that the actions we've been taking over the past couple of years, over the past couple of decades, over the past half a century have done nothing but diminish our hegemony instead of sailing the seas and staying out of people's business and helping people and being the good guy on the block? We've clearly become the bully on the block just by being the only ally of Israel. But don't they realize that all the stuff that we're doing is actually hurting our empire, hurting our hegemony because people are turning their back?
You would think, right? You would think that there are some intelligent, reasoned, measured scholars, intellectuals, even thinkers at the deep state who would, see the big picture and understand things dialectically, that you're not going to get what you want. In fact, you're going to get the exact opposite if you do what you do. But even on a tactical level, we don't see that happening. For example, right now, there are millions of people mourning the passing, the murder of former Supreme Leader Khamenei in Iran. Now, the U.S. should have known that when they took out Khamenei, that they were going to strengthen Iran in a way that would be impossible otherwise.
Right.
They did the thing that strengthened Iran more than in any other fashion. And likewise, on the level of grand strategy, shouldn't they realize that if they want to maintain any sense of hegemony that starts with goodwill and soft power, and that randomly attacking and violently undermining international law and threatening and destroying countries and kidnapping leaders at will does not endear them to anybody? Don't you think that some people would have made that argument? But apparently, it doesn't seem to work that way. And if you read what is coming out of the centers of power, the Eli Ratners, the Seth Jones, the CSIS, the Foreign Affairs, the Council of Foreign Relations, you don't see any of that self-reflection. In fact, I would say this is a leadership that is perhaps incapable of self-reflection. It is incapable of looking itself in the mirror because it doesn't really like what it sees, which is
Right.
blood. It's just blood dripping from head to toe. So it can't do that. And so instead, what they have is a series of ideological filters with which they interpret the world. And one of these ideological filters is realism or neo-realism. This is John Mearsheimer's doctrine, but they've given it another term. They call it, John Mearsheimer is known for offensive realism, but now they've given it another term anyway. But anyway, it's offensive realism. Essentially, their argument, is the world is anarchic. There is no order. States are the atomic actors of this global order. States seek self-interest, but at the same time, we are blind to the intentions of other states. That is, we cannot assume that they are good. We can only imagine that they're out for their own self-interest. And under those circumstances, the only thing that gives us security is to maximize our power and to dominate the other. It's an ideology of complete and total domination, the logical conclusion of which is to aim for total regional and then global hegemony.
And while we're doing this, while we're trying to do this, we're bleeding manufacturing, where we can't keep up with the weapons we need to have this happen. I mean, I just can't help but see in the future, and I don't know how many years, that something's going to happen that will just say, United States, forget it. You're not going to be the hegemon anymore. I don't know whether that's going to be a violent reaction or an economic reaction, or, I mean, it's obvious that we can't do realism in this country, but where do you see our hegemon going?
It's a hard one to call, but I think you're right in that we can see deep fissures in the body politic and among the people. There are serious fault lines. Even for the 4th of July celebrations, there were two separate sets of organizations organizing the celebration. That tells you how divided the country is. But we have to be honest here. The country, as you put it, is bleeding out. things are getting worse and worse. The immiseration is increasing by leaps and bounds. 60% of the population, Jim, lives hand to mouth, right? They do
Hmm.
not have, 60% of families do not have $1,000 savings, which means that they are, the moment something bad happens to them, they're in the street. 39, almost 40% of the US population does not have $500 to its name. These are people, if they get their car towed or a big ticket or, some, car repair, they're finished. They're out in the
Yeah.
streets. The precarity is extraordinary. And so we know that things are getting worse. The number of people who are food insecure, who are unsheltered, the children growing up in poverty, etc. All of this signals that things have turned turned out very, very badly, and there's very, very little hope. So then what happens under those circumstances? What is the outcome of that? Hopefully, there is reasoned and careful transition to better conditions. But do we see any of that being prepared by politicians or being proposed? We don't see that. We just see constant, at the very best, some cheap, easy words and then the same old sellout. And you can see that the forces of oppression are constantly increasing. Just as we are constantly increasing the expenditure on the military, what we're also doing is we're increasing our expenditure on police and prison. So, for example, in the city of Oakland, about 50% of the city's budget goes to police. It's just, police forces. And then another, 17% goes to debt service. And then, the tiny 20 something percent, you fight amongst yourself for the scraps. That's for
Yeah.
everything else: schools, parks, services, everything else. This is the state of affairs. Just one more data point. Think of California. California had 8 prisons up to 1980. Since 1980, it has built 23 more prisons. It has 31 adult prisons, and it built 23 of them since 1980. And during that same period, it has built only one state university, UC Merced. So that gives
Yeah.
you a sense of what the priorities are and what their thinking is. Essentially, the plan is not to educate or uplift the population, but to repress them, to incarcerate them, and to beat them down.
Because if they build it, they're going to have to fill it.
Yes.
And just, oh, that's
Yes.
just
If they
awful.
build it, they will come. Well, they will make sure that people come.
Come.
Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. So, um, let's
So I
see.
didn't I didn't exactly uplift you, Jim,
No,
there.
well, I never expected that. This is the way we go all the time, KJ. Before I let you go, is there anything you wanted to tell the audience that we should be looking out for, that you wanted to say that? Because I only came in wanting to talk about Russia and Ukraine and hopefully get some better news on our kinetic dreams against China. And you didn't help me on either one.
I didn't help you, but as I said, it looks like, they have put a little bit of a rain check on, the immediate plans. And I'll take that for what it is, which is a minor blessing. If things can be delayed, perhaps there can be some cooling off, because the future is always unknown, and we have to be both pessimists of the mind and optimists of the will, that we can and we should attempt to make a difference. And in the meantime, I see my job as, not to give you saccharine pictures of things that, unrealistic images, but to tell the truth as honestly as I can, as I see it, as closely tied to the facts, as I can connect them. And then we all, bring our own, conscience and dedication and solidarity to the continued work of peace, which is essential in this current moment.
What would you have people do? Would you have them get on the street? Would you have them call Congress? What would you have people do?
Yeah, get on the street, educate one another, build solidarity, call Congress to the extent that any pressure can be made, support to the extent possible, wherever possible, third-party candidates if they have a good anti-war platform. If they don't, or if it's saccharine, or if it's disingenuous, of course, don't pay attention to them. They're
Mhm.
just, pimping themselves out until they get into power. But if there is a viable and principled third party candidate, support them. And above all, educate yourself and don't be taken in by the lies, and do everything you can to prevent the war machine from escalating further. Because as I said, what waits us down the corner, is nuclear war. And that is something that none of us should tolerate or even contemplate, or allow our leaders to engage in.
Right. Right. Well, we'll have to probably get you back on and talk about that threat. All right. Okay. Oh, where's if people want to follow you, where's the best place?
Well, you mentioned them, Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, Monthly Review, various progressive magazines, journals. Also, I'm off and on with Danny Haifong, I was just recently on Moats
Yeah.
with George Galloway's show, and other progressive shows. So again, good to support progressive media, including this show, if you can support and spread the good word.
Thanks, KJ. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Talk again soon. Thank you so much.
All right.